All right, welcome to my presentation about resource selection of lesser prairie chickens during the breeding season. As you all know, the grassland ecosystem has seen some large-scale declines in the US since European settlements. Land use change and agricultural intensification have led to habitat loss and fragmentation for many wildlife species. And only last year, Rosenberg et al. Showed again that grassland birds have seen some of the largest declines of any avian guild within the US and Canada. One of these species, the lesser prairie chicken, grassland obligate prairie grouse, have been especially affected by habitat loss and fragmentation. The range of population numbers have declined by about 90%. In recent years, they've been listed or delisted, but are still of conservation concern. Unfortunately, the management of lesser prairie chickens is very complex, especially since resource needs vary greatly throughout the breeding season, with lacking nesting and brooding. However, knowing about resource selection of this species could really help figuring out how to manage largely privately owned landscapes that they occur on. Today, I will show some preliminary analysis looking at the resource selection of lesser prairie chickens during the breeding season. We already know a lot about resource selection of lesser prairie chickens at broad scales. We know that they don't like trees. We do know that they don't like anthropogenic structures like oil wells, power lines, and roads. We do know that they like grass. At least they need a lot of grass on the landscape to even occur at least 60% in a 5-kilometer buffer and thrive on like higher values, like 70 or 80% grassland. However, this raises some questions like what kind of grass? Any grass, and does it matter what kind of grass? Not all grasslands are the same, of course. What's truly available for selection depends on many factors, such as whether a grassland is burned and the fire frequency occurs on, whether a pasture is grazed or not, and the grazing regime takes place, patchwork grazing, season-long stocking, rotational grazing, etc. And the presence or absence or abundance of specific key species like sand sagebrush that is very influential within the lesser prairie chicken range. Moreover, resource selection of lesser prairie chickens might also vary spatially. They occur in 4 distinct ecoregions: the mixed grass prairie in Kansas and the Oklahoma-Texas Panhandle, in central sagebrush prairie in eastern Colorado and western Kansas, the shortgrass prairie in Sierpine Mosaic in northwestern Kansas, and San Chenio prairie in New Mexico and Texas. And the vegetation communities in all these ecoregions are very distinct. So therefore, which grassland patches are truly available and which ones are selected will therefore likely vary throughout the prairie chicken range as well. This brings me to my research questions. So for this project, we established grassland patches instead of just grassland, yes or no, based on grazing, burning, dominant vegetation type, and the presence of sand sagebrush. And this is at 4 sites during 2013 to 2018. And we answered the following questions. Do lesser prairie chickens select for or against certain grassland patch types? And does selection of grassland patch types differ among sites or not? To answer these questions, we trapped lesser prairie chickens at 4 sites in Colorado, Northwest, and our sites Clark and Red Hills in the mixed grass prairie. And together, 4 sites in Kansas, Colorado represent 3 of the 4 occupied ecoregions. And we pulled the 2 subsites in Colorado for sample sizes to form 1 site. And our 4 sites follow an east to west precipitation gradient with consequences for the vegetation that occurs in these landscapes, with less rain resulting in lower vegetation. At those sites, we trapped lesser prairie chickens using walk-in traps and drop nets. And then we put VHF or GPS satellite transmitters on them so we could follow them around in the landscape and know what they actually use. Then we measured vegetation at used and available locations and compared those. For used locations, we had about 4,000 points. We took 2 per week per bird per site during the spring and the summer, random locations. And available locations, we did a little bit more. We had about 12,000 points. We first determined the study area as a minimum complex polygon around all GPS locations at a certain site. Then we established grassland patches based on rangeland management and apparent differences in vegetation due to maybe underlying variation in soil, elevation, or other factors. Then in all those patches, we took 1 to 30 locations per patch per site during the spring and summer to measure vegetation as well. At all those used and available locations, we measured grass cover, forb cover, shrub cover, bare ground, and litter cover with a Daubenmeier frame, and we also took maximum vegetation height in 0, 25, 50, 75, and 100% visual obstruction readings with the use of a roll-out hole, as you can see on the right. Took these measurements in all 4 cardinal directions at 4-meter distance of the point and at the center of the point as well, and then average those values. Then categorized each of the sampled patches according to a set of rules to come up with the patch type. First, whether a patch was grazed or not, then whether a patch was burnt or not that particular year, whether a sand sagebrush was present during any year based on separate transect surveys, and then vegetation cover type based on dominant cover type, whether it's like grass dominated, forb dominated, grass forb mixture, or whether it had shrubs in it and at least 10% of them. We then measured the area of each patch type to determine their relative availability. And finally, we assigned all the used points to grassland patch type based on their location. And this is what we found. First of all, some key differences among patch types. First of all, CRP fields were never burned or grazed, and they often had tall vegetation, and especially in the western sites, taller vegetation than we found in pastures. When we compared grazed and ungrazed pastures, which is anomaly in Colorado, we saw that less grass cover and more shrub cover in the ungrazed pastures. Burned versus unburned pastures, we only had those in the Red Hills, and we saw less grass and little cover, but more background and lower structure in burned pastures, which makes sense. We also looked at the cover classes, and because we used our own cutoff rules, they matched those. And finally, sand sagebrush, whether it was present or not, we didn't find any differences between those patch types in other vegetation characteristics. So any selection based on that would have to do with the sand sagebrush itself. All right, so I'll go from west to east to show the patterns of selection. We'll start with Colorado. The next couple of slides, I'll show similar slides to this one. So that you can see here on top, we first have the percent available on the landscape. And you can see in Colorado that it mostly consisted out of grassy CRP fields, grassy grazed pastures, and grassy ungrazed pastures. So that's what's available. And then I'll use selection ratios to show the actual selection. Selection ratios are percent used locations divided by the percentage of available area. So if they would be the same, no selection, it would be 1, but you can imagine a selection ratio of 2. It would be twice as many locations in that particular patch type related to how much it is available on the landscape. This is what we found. In Colorado, Lesser Prairie-chickens select for CRP fields, and very strongly so. If you zoom in a little bit more, you can see that they also select against grazed pastures, with some of these categories not even having a single used location in them, although they make up almost 15% of the landscape. When we move on to the northwest, we see that this mostly existed out of grassy CRP fields and grassy pastures. Not a lot of other things going on here. And what I actually select is select for sand sagebrush and shrubby areas instead on the right. Although shrubs are not even that available on the landscape in large amounts. In Clark, we see that the landscape consists out of a mix of forby, grassy, and shrubby pastures, mostly grassy pastures. When we look at selection patterns, we see that Lesser Prairie-chickens on this side select pastures with mostly forbs. When we go to the Red Hills, we see that the Red Hills consist out of mostly grassy pastures, unburned pastures, but there's also some burned grassy pastures and some pastures with grass and forb mixture in them. And here as well, just like the Clark side, we see that Lesser Prairie-chickens select for pastures with forbs. Very strong selection on the right, on the left here. And if you zoom in a little bit more, we see that also grass forb mixtures are selected for, and they mostly select against all grass types, and just grassy pastures without forbs or shrubs in them. So to sum this all up, there were a lot of graphs, and luckily you can pause it. On the west here in Colorado, we could see that Lesser Prairie-chickens selected for CRP fields, and it might be because of structure. It's a western side, low vegetation, except for in the CRP fields. In the northwest, they selected for pastures with shrubs or sand sagebrush. Again, in a relatively arid environment, this could provide some structure on the landscape for chickens to use during the breeding season as cover or other ways. However, we see a different pattern in the Clark and the Red Hills on the right bottom here, where both sites they selected for pastures with forbs. So maybe structure is not as limited in those sites, and forbs are much more important potentially as a food source. So conclusions, we've seen that overall Lesser Prairie-chickens seem to select taller grasses or pastures with at least 10% shrubs or sagebrush in the western sites where the precipitation is limited. So overall, resource selection shows considerable variation among sites, even within the same ecoregion. And although that's cool from an ecological perspective, the lack of fixed selection patterns might be very frustrating from a management perspective, since they seem to be doing something different everywhere you go. Of course, there's a bunch of questions that remain. We see different selection patterns in different sites in years, although I didn't show that. But is the end product always the same if available? Is a patch type approach an improvement of our broad category grassland or a fine scale vegetation measurements only approach? How do other landscape factors interact with patch type selection? Anthropogenic structures, presence of nearby trees, grassland availability at the larger scale. And finally, how does patch selection during the breeding season depend on breeding stage when birds are on the nest or with chicks? And with that, I acknowledge all these people, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, this is my email address. Thank you.